I want to start with a story about the largest bouquet of flowers that I've ever seen. And it is definitely not, I didn't pay for it. I didn't buy it for my wife. Don't tell her that I saw such a beautiful bouquet, but it was, I don't know if that's the largest one I've seen because I was young. I was about, let's say, 12, maybe 13 at the time. My youngest brother was about three, four, and he got into a surgery. Not a life-threatening surgery by any means. His belly button wouldn't come in, you know. So they went and they did a surgery. By the way, the same surgeon who operated on my youngest brother operated on my son uh, many years later. Anyway, for again, not anything serious, but the reason I'm telling you is that after the surgery, my parents get this beautiful, magnanimous, like giant bouquet of flowers. I still remember it. It was white and purple and simply magnificent. Again, I was young, but I've never seen such a big, beautiful bouquet of flowers. And I asked my father, who, who sent you these flowers? Because my parents were not big on flowers. Occasionally my father would get my mother flowers, but nothing, that neither my mother wasn't keen on these things, so neither was my father. They're not keen on these things today either. So I asked him, who gave you these flowers? So my father looks at the note and he says, "Oh, it's from a good friend of mine, Ali Jabr Sabah." Right. That is a Kuwaiti actually family. It's the royal family in Kuwait. My father was is still an engineer. He's not working anymore, but until recently he retired. But he was the CEO of a company known as Gilat Satcom, satellite communication, an Israeli company, and they were dealing with satellite communication. So naturally, they were interacting with places in the world where you would have less of a infrastructure that was very good, and some of their clientele were in the Gulf War, in the Gulf region, and among Middle Eastern countries. But whenever they would sell to them anything, they would have to kind of make sure that there was no Israeli signage, postage, stickers, anything in Hebrew, anything with indicating that this is an Israeli company. And it was kind of a very well known secret that we have good ties with some countries. Back then it was 96, 97 maybe. And obviously with the political ups and downs, the relationship between Israel and other countries went up and down for various reasons. But recently, this relationship, which was on the low, making sure nobody knows this big secret, became on the table relationship with the United Arab Emirates. I should say that it's not just that it became uh, on the table relationship, but the flack that the United Arab Emirates got from the Palestinians and from other parts, some mainly the Iranians and the Palestinians, was met with a complete disregard, I should say. And I wanted to ask Iddo, start our conversation with Iddo today about this subject. And then hopefully we want to get into Seeds of Peace, continuing the theme of this week. I just want to tell you, Iddo, that we just had Rabbi Michael Melchior yesterday talking about his religious peace initiative. I definitely want to ask you, what do you think is the role of religion in the peace process? Um, because his approach is very different than the type of peace that we were used to kind of in the last 30 years of peace processes. or process. I don't know if it's a couple of or one, but anyway. So that's a little bit about the United Arab Emirates. And what are the Emirates? What is it?
Well, it's a good question. What are the Emirates? Up until let's say the 19th century, no one was interested in what happens in Arabia. It descended into, basically it's a desert. And
Camel riding savages, that's it. No oil
well,
yet, you know.
we can look at it, let's look at it a bit, let's open the history of it a bit and look at it a bit farther away. If you look at it, for example, before the rise of Islam in the 7th century, then you see that although the majority of it is desert, the peninsula, the Arab Peninsula, had an important role in commerce. Whether it's spices or perfume that come from India, and then with camels into the night. You don't ride camels on the day. You don't ride camels in general. Camels are not for riding. Camels are for carrying baggage or luggage or commercial artifacts. And then you take the camels, if you try to imagine it, for example, for a minute, you take a ship from India and you arrive at what is today Oman, and then from there on camels at night through the Hadramaut all the way to Yemen, and then they take a strong right and all the way through Mecca to the ports of Syria and the land of Israel and Lebanon, and from there again a ship with the commerce to Europe. So it was pretty significant, this commercial land called the Persian route. And when the Arabs are there, when there's the Arab Peninsula, oh yes, thank you. So
we can
get
do
to Muscat,
stuff, yeah.
Muscat, and then from there to through the Hadramaut, Oman, Yemen to Sana'a, and from there the strong right all the way from Mecca and up to the ports of Mecca, yes, and then all the way to the ports of Syria and Israel and Lebanon and Alexandria and stuff like that. So, and then when the Arabs take over,
mainly in the route that is alongside the sea. So not the inward part of the peninsula, never, but only the outskirts.
The inward parts are actually called the Rubh al-Khali, the empty quarter, because there are tribes there, but there isn't any reason for anyone to get there, because it's simply desert and it's a pretty harsh desert. But then when the Prophet Muhammad comes and there's this kingdom of Islam and it becomes an empire of Islam, the Arab Peninsula never played a major role in this, in the sovereign politics of Islam, because pretty soon after the Prophet dies, the capital moves to Damascus and then to Baghdad. And Yemen plays a big role in this because the Arab Sea and the Indian Ocean is Mare Nostrum, is like the sea of the Arabs. It's the sea of the Muslims. They control our sea. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, when you use the Latin, it's preferable to translate. At least for me, not the others. The others are intelligent, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, as much as the Romans called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea, because it was their kingdom, basically. The same goes for the Arab Sea and the Indian Ocean, where commerce was almost entirely a monopoly of Muslims. Okay, to the point where if you point at China for a second, when they want to send a delegation to these areas, they send a Muslim Chinese named Zheng He in 1421. So and everything around that sea is basically Muslim. Even the southern parts of India, some of it is Muslim kingdoms. Pakistan, of course, Iran. But then, as it happens, we talked about it, the big crisis of Islam in modern times, in the 18th century, the 19th century, and it falls into decay, basically. And also also important things that happened is that this route is not important anymore because you have the New World, you have the Americas, you have European powers trading with the Far East, going all the way around Africa, and then from the end of the 19th century going through the Suez Canal. So it wasn't a very important area, but the British controlled most of the shores of the southern shores, Yemen and Oman, and also to what is today United Arab Emirates. And it was considered, by the way, an area that was kind of dangerous. There were pirates there. But then in around the 19th century, the United Arab Emirates is not still called the United Arab Emirates, it's called the Stolen Shore or something like that. Let me just check if I remember correctly. Wait, just a second. Yeah, it's called just the Trucial Coast or the Trucial States, and it was considered basically it's a group of emirates, it's a group of Arab princes controlling their own tribes, and in the 1971 they became the United Arab Emirates. Again, not a very important country in itself, but by then we already have the most important resource the Middle East had to offer, which is oil. And once it became important, so it became part of OPEC, and to this day, the oil fields
For those of us who don't know what OPEC is,
petroleum exporting countries. It's a cartel of petroleum exporting countries that decides on how to export oil to the rest of the world, where the majority of the countries that are part of it are in the Arab Peninsula, whether it's Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and this area is still important because of that. But also, and this is something that is worth mentioning right now because I think it connects well to what is happening now, is that the United Arab Emirates has managed to be a country where trade and commerce is becoming very important. They don't have any taxes there. It's very easy for companies to work there. And one of the things that is important to remember is that the United Arab Emirates, up until a few years ago, or even a few months ago, had very good commercial connections with Iran. Iranian companies that wanted to bypass the sanctions that the Americans and the world put on Iran because of the nuclear issue, a lot of them worked from the United Arab Emirates. And then, so this is one important thing to remember. And then if you just scroll out a bit, so we see the whole Arab Peninsula, it's very interesting because we talked about it, about how the Iranians, we are facing now a Cold War in the Middle East between basically the Iranians and the Saudis, the Sunnis and the Shiites.
Right. Someone asked me about it and about what was it, and I drew their attention to the fact that Iran and Saudi Arabia are currently fighting a proxy war in 3 to 4 different places. You know.
Yeah. So it happens in Syria, where the Iranians are backing the regime and the Saudis are backing the rebels. It happens in Yemen, in a horrible, horrible civil war where southern Yemen...
Maybe the worst place on earth at the moment.
Yeah. Whether it's the southern Yemen, which is also connected to the history of Yemen. Don't know if you want to go into that, but Yemen is divided between the northern parts, which are more Shiites, and the southern parts, which are more Sunnis. And it was actually divided in the 20th century,
right,
between a southern republic, which was part of the, let's say, the Soviet
sphere of influence, yeah,
and a sphere of influence, and the northern one. But then it was reunited again in 1990 but the trouble still remained. And today what we have in Yemen is basically, it's divided into, let's say, largely three parts, where the northwest is more Shiite and controlled by the Houthis, which are tribes that are Shiites. The southern part, which is controlled by the Sunnis, and the western part, which is in no man's land and with a lot of Al-Qaeda. The eastern parts are controlled more by Al-Qaeda. So, so in Yemen, we have a proxy war. It's a very harsh war between the Saudis and the Iranians. And another
in a country that already suffered from a very shaky economy
in a country that was one of the poorest in the world.
Right, for various reasons. The funniest of all is their use of gat, by the way, which consumes a lot of the water. It takes a lot of water to grow gat, and the instead of going into wheat or other things, it goes to gat, as well as the fact that you only work half a day. You know, the second half of the day you dance and sing. So.
Well, eating gat is not a very let's say, you don't have a lot of motivation to work after you eat gat.
Right.
Gut. It's actually
right with a K, I think, in English, but
it's with a Q, I think, but
right,
maybe in English.
In Arabic, right?
It comes from qat in Arabic, but it's gut.
Yeah, KH, at least according to probably various different spellings. Anyway, guys.
Yeah. So so this is the gut.
And it's considered to be.
Did you try gut?
For sure, I did. For sure, I did. I live in Gedera. Come on.
Yeah, you live in Gedera. Okay, that's it. You live in Gedera. Gedera is like Kiryat Ekron, I think, right next to you is the capital, the gut capital of Israel. Right?
Well, maybe second to Rosh Hashanah. Who knows? But anyway, I tried. It's quite bitter. It takes getting used to, and the practice is unbelievable. While people in Israel of Yemenite origin usually do it on Thursday nights, you know, during the night, they sit all night, they chew on it, they hold it in the side of their mouth like this, if you see, and goes with a nargila, hookah, usually, and singing. We had Rabbi Dr. Eliyahu Aviad representing the Yemenite traditions. We didn't ask him about gat, but we did hear some Yemenite singing as well. So they actually do half a day of work, and then they sit, what's known as takhzina, right? They sit and they chew on gat, and they dance with they have like daggers, and it's interesting, and it's really affected their economy, the gat.
It really affected. It's really amazing to see. Although also one has to say that these are also the areas where coffee was first discovered in Ethiopia and later on in Yemen. So coffee is also a big part, but it doesn't balance it out. Somehow it doesn't balance it out. You're still more affected by gut than by coffee. So if you look at the Middle East right now, you have a proxy
we've talked
war.
about We've talked about Syria, Yemen, and do you want to go
Syria,
Libya?
Yemen, and we'll talk about Libya in a second.
Okay.
It's addictive. It's supposed to be addictive, the gut.
Yeah, it's forbidden in Europe. You cannot bring it into Europe. I don't know what's the situation in the States, but in Europe it's illegal. It's considered to be a drug. In Israel, it's permitted. So if you want to try something that is illegal in Europe, in Israel, you can do it here. Why is it legal? Because we have many people who came from Yemen, and now many people who came from Ethiopia. So you cannot really tell them, listen, that's illegal, because that would be too much to ask. So it's legal in Israel.
So going from, I hate to tear you away from gut, but going back into politics.
Right.
So what we see now is a consolidation of this front, meaning that up until now, you had the Saudis and the Iranian fighting their proxy war, but you also had Saudi satellite countries, okay? Oman, Bahrain, and to a certain point, the United Arab Emirates are all, they also have a treaty, okay? It's called the Dar'. They have a treaty of the Arabian Peninsula. They fight together in Yemen, but also, for example, when Bahrain, who has a big minority, which is actually a majority of Shiites, 65%, when they in 2011 went to the streets as part of the Arab Spring, the forces that were oppressing them, the tanks that came into the streets of Bahrain, of Manama, the capital, were Saudi tanks. And again, because the Saudis sees the Iranian as the threat. Now, if we look at the Middle East in general, we are now seeing three big powers in the Middle East, or four. We see the Iranians, we see the Saudis, we see we see Turkey, and we see Israel. And Israel is, and this is very important because Israel is a part of the Middle East. Sometimes Israelis like to see themselves as European, but we are
Listen,
part of the Middle
you're
East.
German. I'm British and Czech. I don't know what you're talking about.
We are. I know we like to perform at the Eurovision, and we like to lose. Our football team likes to lose to European football teams. But
we were kicked out of Asia, by the way. You know that.
Yeah.
Nobody would play with us. Maybe
Nobody
we
would
should
play
go
with
back. Now we can play the Emirates. Maybe we should go back. We'll do better.
We'll definitely do better, but it's also part of how, and I'd like to say something that is crucial about Israelis. Zionism, the way it was turned out to be, it didn't have to go that way. And Israel in general, politics in Israel in general, we see ourselves as not Middle Eastern. And to the point where we talk about a villa in the jungle, we talk about the neighborhood.
Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak.
Ehud Barak was the one who was in charge of this wonderful expression. We talk about being a frontier of the West in the East. And this is part of a bigger conversation, a bigger discourse of clash of civilizations. But if we want to see Israel, the real geopolitical position, we have to see Israel as part of the Middle East. And as part of the Middle East, the Saudis look to the right and they look to the left, and they had to make a decision. And the decision they make is that the stronger the Iranians are, the more, that's true, the more the Iranians get stronger, they have to have a strong ally. And that strong ally is, of course, Israel. And so ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia in the past, I would say 10 years, but it comes even earlier. And I'll point to that in a second, have become under the table or sometimes a bit on the table, but have become more apparent and more clear, okay? And this includes also parts of the world, parts of the Arab world that are associated or aligned with Saudi Arabia. Another big issue to deal with is that there used to be another power in the Middle East. It was called Egypt. But Egypt, after the turmoil of 2011, lost its way and lost its gravitas in the Middle East, and it's now trying to somehow get it back. But Egypt cannot stand alone anymore, not economically. It was never a very strong economic country, but now it's even poorer, and definitely not in terms of the geopolitical balance. So what happens now is that I was not surprised, okay, and I think many people were not really surprised by the United Arab Emirates and Israel declaring that we have a peace treaty, okay? Unlike many of my friends on the left-wing side, and I'm a left-wing, let's put it on the table, in Israeli terms, I'm very left-wing, are saying this is not really a big thing. This is, you know, it's normalization. It's not really peace. I disagree. It's a big thing. It's a big thing. Any agreement between Israel and an Arab country is an issue because for years we treated ourselves as Europeans and they treated us as invaders. And as long as the saying in the Arab world was at first complete disrecognition, we don't recognize the state of Israel. We don't talk about it. Israelis are banned We'll talk about Sudan in a second. Israelis are banned from, even if you go as far as Malaysia, okay? Malaysian passports, I saw it once, has like, this passport is valid for every country in the world except Israel, okay? We can't go to Indonesia, not talking even about Pakistan and places like that. The Muslim world in general and the Arab world specifically simply denied the existence of Israel, to the point where if you open up newspapers, it was not Israel, it was not Israel, it was either Israel with, the, how do you say it
Air
in
quotes.
air quotes, or it
Yeah.
was Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv, never Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, or El Kiyan Sahuni, the Zionist regime. We started
And by
seeing
the
the
way,
shift.
sorry to get in the middle. Yesterday, no, a couple of days ago, one of my former guests, Dr. Roy Yosevich, had an interesting conversation with Rabbi Tovia Singer, who is the chief rabbi of Indonesia. Believe it or not, he is an American-born rabbi. He is he is a very interesting guy, and he said that one of the founders of Indonesia, and I didn't know that, one of the people involved in the founding of Indonesia as a modern state was Haj Amin al-Husseini. And this is one of the, again, I didn't check it out yet, but this is what he said. And he usually talks, interesting, incredible stuff. So
I'll add to that. In 1955, in Bandung, in Indonesia, there's the conference of the non-affiliated states.
mm-hmm.
Okay, countries that are part of the UN, now new states under the decolonization, who are saying we're not part of the Soviet sphere and we're not part of the USA sphere and Western Europe sphere, and we want to create our own sphere, the third world as they call it. And it's Tito from Yugoslavia, and it's Sukarno from Indonesia, it's Nehru from India, and it's Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt. And Israel was supposed to be in that conference. Okay, Israel was one of the states that was not aligned, not with the United States, nor with the Soviet Union, and during its first years in the 1950s. But then the Arab state just said, and Gamal Abdel Nasser was very strong then, he said, if they're coming, we're not coming. And the Indonesian, of course, backed them, and the rest of the Muslim world backed them. And so Israel was not part of this conference, and was kind of pushed towards the Western sphere. Not a bad decision by Ben-Gurion to go to the Western sphere, but still very hard emotions, to the point where it's not that in the 50s there weren't attempts for peace. Okay, even Gamal Abdel Nasser, who's very strong in his rhetoric against Israel, especially after 1956, when Israel and France and Britain
again, talking about thinking you're a European country working with England and France in the Suez crisis.
In the Suez crisis, okay, it's what in Arabic it's called al-Udwan al-Thulathi, the three-part aggression. Okay, aggression from three parts, from Israel and the Britain and France, and even before that, and after that also, there were attempts to have peace talks in the Middle East. Okay, it was very clandestine. A lot of the things are still in the archives and are not open, but we know there were chances for peace then. But then again, Israel always saw itself as part of Europe, even then, and the Arab world refused to recognize Israel. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, where Israel tripled its territory and conquered, occupied, freed, liberated, whatever you want to call it, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Gaza Strip, and Sinai. In 1968,
you can see everything, basically everything. You see the line here and here and here, as well as all of this triangle, which is the Sinai Peninsula, that was added to the 1949 armistice line. This is basically the line, and everything beyond that was conquered in 1967, most of which we gave back by now, like two-thirds or the vast majority of it was Sinai and the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Height was officially added to Israel, annexed. And so the big question that remains still is the West Bank, which is a
And
ridiculous name.
I would say that Gaza is a bit more complicated than say that we gave it back, but
we didn't give it back because the Egyptians were there, but we're not there anymore.
And I would say again, we're not there is very interesting.
Right. But yeah, we're not officially there. That's for sure.
It's a complicated issue,
sure.
to say the least.
Is there any non-complicated issue when it comes to the Middle East? Right.
It's a good question. It's a fair question. But in 1968, there is a conference in Khartoum, in the capital of Sudan. The Arab League, still a very strong force in the Arab world, and they go to the three no's. No to recognition for Israel, no to any peace negotiations, no to any compromise. There cannot be any peace talks with the Zionist regime. And the first country to break that line, the first country to break the Arab line of saying no was Egypt. And in 1970, there's a change of regime in Egypt. Gamal Abdel Nasser dies, and instead of him comes Anwar Sadat, who's supposed to be a compromise candidate up until they decide who's going to be the next president, and he stays there. And Sadat understands that by 1970, Egypt is totally dependent on the Soviets, and he wants to open Egypt up to the West. And the way to Washington goes through Jerusalem and goes through Israel. And so in 1970, 1971, there are a couple of peace proposals, very clandestine, from the Egyptians to Israel. The Israeli government is drunk with power by then, where there's a total euphoria. When I say we, it's the government, refuses any negotiations. You point to Sharm el-Sheikh, of course. Sharm el-Sheikh,
yeah.
There's a famous saying of Moshe Dayan, who's the defense minister, and he said, it's better to have Sharm el-Sheikh without peace than to have peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. And he also has
so this is like this is at the end of the Sinai Peninsula. You can see Sharm el-Sheikh. I'm sure you remember Moshe Dayan with a eye patch. So the joke was that when Prime Minister Golda Meir would see that something was leaked to the press, she would say, if I would know who did it, I would take out his other eye. Right.
Yeah, and Moshe Dayan also as a second saying, which I think is even more crucial, he says that it's clear that without peace negotiations and without peace, there's going to be another war. And then he goes, so there'll be another war, and we'll win it as well. And because that was the general atmosphere. And Sadat understands that we cannot, that the as he puts it, the Israelis understand only power and only force. And so he initiates a war. It's the 1973 war, and he initiates a very limited war. The war is meant to pressure Israel into a negotiation. And it's very successful in those terms, because a lot of Egyptians are killed. One of the armies of Egypt is actually circled by Israel. The Syrians in the Golan Heights are trying also to start a war. They were convinced to do it with the Egyptians, but they also, the Israeli army goes 40 kilometers from Damascus, very close to Damascus. The Israeli army on the Cairo side is 101 kilometers from Cairo. So the war is not a loss of Israeli power, or Israel didn't lose Yom Kippur, the 1973 war, but in Israeli memory, it's a debacle. It's a horrible, it's a disaster, because the whole first line of defense was destroyed. And again, we retaliated very quickly, but 2,700 Israeli soldiers were killed. More soldiers were killed in Egypt, but in Israel, it was a big trauma. But this trauma gets us directly to direct talks, the first time we have direct talks between Israel and Egypt, and eventually it becomes the peace process that we saw from 1975 to 1979 between Israel and Egypt, which culminated in 1977 in the surprise visit that Sadat made to Jerusalem. And in November 1977, when he was supposed to come, a lot of Israelis didn't know, even the Israeli government didn't know if he's really going to come. There were all kinds of speculations whether it's going to happen or not. And when it did happen eventually, it was outrageous. Because it's not that the Arab line of saying no to Israel was broken. It was broken by the leader of the Arab League, by the leader of the Arab states, which was Egypt. But Egypt was so strong that by 1979, when it signed the peace accords with Israel and the Sinai Peninsula went back to Egypt, it took 4 or 5 years, and the rest of the Arab world moved along with Egypt. It's not that we had peace conversation with everyone, but by the 1980s, and especially the 1990s, it was clear that we're in a different historical period. We're not doing wars, the big wars of 1973, the 1967, 1948, not even 1956. There are no direct wars anymore. Now,
we do have a bit of a war in 1982 with some Syrian forces involved, but it's not the same magnitude, sure.
It's not the same magnitude. It's not an army against army. It's hardly an army against army. You have a few Syrian
Syria
regiments, but that's it. So it's a very, in terms of, if you look at it from the point of view of military history, it's a whole different period. But the whole real different period starts in 1990 with the fall of the Soviet Union and with the first Gulf War between Iraq and the United States. Iraq invades Saddam Hussein.
And the coalition. It's not just...
Yeah, Iraq invades, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, and the United States forms a coalition with also Arab countries like Egypt in the coalition. And Israel suffers 49 missiles that were big missiles, Scud missiles, that were shot at Israel. One person was killed, but Israel did not react. And the reason Israel did not react is that we had a lot of pressure from the Americans not to react, because any reaction of Israel would ruin the balance of the coalition that was partly with Arab states. And so there starts a whole different age of negotiations. And those negotiations starts in 91 in Madrid, with still under Prime Minister Shamir, but then in 92, Rabin comes to power, and we have this age of the 90s where, if we look at it from the whole world, we talked about the end of history and how liberals are going to win the history.
We've mentioned that when we had a conversation with Dr. Einat Wilf. And
yes. And I saw that conversation. I disagreed with everything she said.
Okay, that's for sure. But depends when. If we would have had the conversation maybe 20 years ago, you would have agreed with what you would say.
I'm a child of the 90s, and it would be interesting to see what's your take on it. But I'm a child of the 90s. My parents were left-wing also, and in the 90s there was a feeling like my mother said, the first time she felt like I'm not going to have to go to the army. There might be real peace here.
That's what she said as well, in that sense that the end of history, the fall of the Soviet Union, that's what I asked her.
She was right about the 90s feeling, but the thing is, that feeling was very specific for a very specific kind of, A, Israelis, B, it was part of the Palestinians did not feel it at all, okay? And in the general, but if we talk about for a second the Arab world, because we are talking about the Arab world, we had offices or on the table connections with the United Arab Emirates, with Qatar, with of course Jordan in 1994, but Jordan,
Morocco, I think.
I would say Morocco. Rabin visited Indonesia. Okay, when we talked about Indonesia earlier, Rabin visited Indonesia. And it was something that was, there were conversations with Pakistan. There was a whole, I thought that there might be a general peace that would, but it was all around a focal point, which is the Palestinians. Because at that point, the Arab world changed its message. The Palestinians changed their message in 1988, and they said, we'll agree to a state. The capital needs to be in East Jerusalem. The state will be in 67 borders, and we'll find a righteous, rightful, and just and long solution for the refugees. Okay, which again can be interpreted in different ways, also to Palestinians themselves. Some of them interpreted as the full right of return. Some of them interpreted in different ways.
حق العودة حق العودة حق العودة, right?
True. And I think Dr. Inayat touched on that, and I think she missed some of the diversity that exists in the Palestinian society, in Israel, in the territories, and in the Shatat, in the diaspora, around the discussion of Haq al-Awda and what does it mean to have a right or to implement a right. It's two different things.
Right, these are two different things, no doubt. Listen, you have Zechut HaShiva, you have the right of return for Jews, and still, I would say 50 to 55% of Jews do not implement it.
So there is a big diversity even amongst Palestinians themselves around what can be or what does it mean to have Haq al-Awda, to have the right of return. And I think Wilf and her partner in that book are missing out on some of the diversity that exists inside the Palestinian society in those terms. But the main idea is that the whole connection with the Arab world at that point revolved around the Palestinian question. Okay, and the Arab world message was, we will not move a centimeter forward without Palestinian consent, without you solving the Palestinian issue. Okay, and besides Egypt and Jordan, we did not have any real peace accords with any Arab state, because everybody—
and even those peace accords, we should say, I think are very different than what's happening now, because they were peace accords that took us from the level of being enemies to a level of maybe peace between government, but still animosity between people.
I think we need to look at the two accords differently.
Okay.
Egypt had a very specific interest, okay, and it managed beautifully. Okay, Egypt is this got through the 90s and the early 21st century, got the biggest amount of money, foreign aid, from the United States other than Israel. Okay, so the Americans paid Israel about $3.3 billion a year for security aid, and they paid Egypt $1.8 billion. It was the second largest a year.
It should be said that it's money that goes back to the American economy. It's not that we can
70% of it, even more, goes back to the American economy. But the idea is that the army of Israel is based on American knowledge, American
equipment,
equipment, and the same goes for the Egyptians. The same goes
actually, the Egyptian actually diversify we had Dr. Yagil Henkin speaking back here, and they are kind of diversifying their military. They buy from whoever is selling.
But you're right. But if you look at the whole rank of high-ranking officers, including Sisi himself, okay, in the military, in the Egyptian military, they all went at a certain point to the United States. They all have connections with the United States military, and Egypt was very much dependent on the United States. So that's Egypt. And they didn't have any interest, also being the Arab leaders at that point, they didn't have any interest in warming relations with Israel, other than one more thing, which is the economy. And if they got, for example, selling gas before we had the gas discoveries in Israel, most of our gas came from Egypt. The Jordanians is a whole different issue. Jordan and Israel were very close all throughout the history of the two countries.
Even in the 1948, I think
In 1948, 2 days before the Declaration of Independence, Golda Meir meets with Abdallah I, who's then Amir, who's then just prince of Jordan, because Jordan was not a kingdom yet. And and Palestinians, by the way, to this day are certain there was an agreement between Jordan and Israel. And if you look at the maps of the battles of 1948, there wasn't a single battle between us and the Jordanians that we didn't lose, and that was also inside or close to the Jewish state borders. Okay, there were heavy battles. There were a lot of people killed. We lost the old city, Gush Etzion, south of Jerusalem, was destroyed. But the end of the war, we always had connections with the Jordanians, to the point where the first Jordanian king, Abdullah I, was murdered by a Palestinian in 1952 because of what was perceived as his cooperation with Israel. But it was really, when was peace really a part of Jordan and Israel's relations? Again, very clandestine. It was around water. In 1964, the Jordanians built a huge canal going through the Jordan Valley. They're part of the Jordan Valley called the Ghor, and we built around those years the pipeline the water pipeline that goes from the Kinneret to the south. And this is a secret agreement between Israel and Jordan. In 1967, the Jordanians waited as far as
we had Tomer Malchi speaking about that in the past, the brother of Yuval Malchi, if you know.
Yuval Malchi is doing an excellent job.
So his brother was speaking. Yeah, so his brother was speaking with us. He's a water engineer working with African countries. Very
so Jordan was always we had good relations with Jordan. So it's a bit different. And again, it's not about the people, because the Jordanian people are very loyal to the king, at least the Bedouins. But between the governments, you always had this clandestine understanding. Even 1970, during the Black September, the civil war in Jordan between Jordanians and Palestinians, we have military aid for the Jordanians. In 1967, the reason Jordan joined into the war was in order not to have the Palestinians riot in the Eastern Bank. So they lost the West Bank, but they won the East Bank. And in 1973, in October, King Hussein comes here, meets with Golda Meir, the prime minister, and says, listen, the Egyptians and Syrians are going to start a war. And no one really listened to him. So we had good relations with Jordan even before 1994. And we had to wait. The Jordanians waited for the Palestinians to make a move in 1993 in order to sign the agreement. But again, other than Jordan and Egypt, the rest of the Arab world, the whole relations were dependent on the Palestinian problem. And then comes Iran. Because when Iran becomes a regional power, okay, when it goes out of the war years with Iraq in the 1980s and into the 1990s, and it's evident that it's no longer the Shiites who are sitting down waiting for their Messiah to come, but they are active. They are encouraging people, Shiites around the Middle East, to rebel against the Sunnis. When it's evident that Iran is trying to become a regional power, then the Arab world, the Sunni Arab world, is looking right and left and saying, okay, we need an ally. And this is where things really start to shift, because it's not that the Arab world really liked the Palestinians or was very connected to them. But it broke the taboo of saying, we'll wait for the Palestinians and then we'll make peace with Israel. No, if the Iranians are coming, we'll run back to Israel. And this brings us to this year even. If you will go, and again, I'm sorry to bring up economy. I'm not an economist or an economy historian. It's more history of thought that I'm interested in. But the United Arab Emirates had something like $19 billion trade with Iran. But a few months back, Iran signed an agreement with China, and which bypasses the whole sanctions and gives Iran some air in terms of economy. And this consolidated the United Emirates, who were always part of the Saudi front, back to the Saudis. And I think this is what pushed the United Arab Emirates into declaring peace with Israel. And again, it's part of a bigger movement. And but the country we need to look at right now, interestingly enough, is Libya. Because the consolidation, we see it very nicely in Libya. Because in Libya, we have forces,
Civil war, right.
we have a civil war between the forces of General Haftar and the government.
Right,
And the
Khalifa
government is
Haftar
backed,
and right, Sarraj, right.
and the government is backed by Egypt and therefore by Saudi Arabia, okay, and also United Arab Emirates, okay, who are part of it. On the other side of the aisle, from the groom side or the bride side, whatever you want to call it, Haftar is backed by Turkey, okay, and Turkey is sending more and more people there. And look who condemned the agreement. The strongest condemnation you've heard was from Turkey, okay? Turkey wrote, as if Turkey doesn't have an embassy in Tel Aviv, right? Turkey wrote, it's everybody's talking about the knife in the back of the Palestinians, as if anyone cares about the Palestinians. But Turkey, so we now have on one side Saudi, United Arab Emirates, and now Oman, Bahrain. Oman already, Netanyahu visited there.
Right.
Bahrain, okay. Sudan, by the way.
Now, right.
Sudan, up until a few years ago, was under Omar al-Bashir. Omar al-Bashir was very close to the Iranians. Okay, although he's a Sunni and they're Shiites, he was very close to the Iranians. And now, when he fell, and he fell a few months ago, Sudan is going to the Saudis, and they're declaring tonight, they declared a few hours ago, that they're in a peace process with Israel. And so this is one side, and the southern Yemenites, and the other side is the Shiites, and Iranian backed, and also Turkey, and one more country which is a wild card, and it can go either way, it's Qatar. Qatar is
Qatar, you think Qatar can go either way? Very interesting.
I think Qatar can go either way because Qatar, on the one hand, is it's sitting right there on the edge of Saudi Arabia, and
it needs Saudi Arabia. It doesn't have an outlet like a land outlet.
No, if you read Al Jazeera is the network. Okay, it's one of the first Arab broadcast networks, and its only interest is the Qatar interests. Okay, they don't care. They are fierce criticizers of Saudi Arabia, especially,
right, I know.
Especially Saudi Arabia under MBS, under Mohammed bin Salman. And they are also at the same time fiercely Sunni, okay, very much afraid of the Iranians, okay, and they sit right in the middle. So Qatar is a wild card, okay. Look, for example, okay, what happened right after the announcement of the peace between Israel and the United Arab Emirates?
No, I don't know. What was the Qatar response? It's interesting. What did Al Jazeera say?
So Al Jazeera reclaimed again the knife in the back of the Palestinians and the Arabs. But the other thing that happened is that the south of Israel suddenly got warmer, hotter. Okay. Now the Iranians are pushing Hamas to pressure Israel in those terms. Okay. In the idea that if Israel reacts, it would be hard for the United Arab Emirates to really implement this kind of peace while Israel reacts very harshly against Gaza. But there's also a way out. Now the Hamas are saying, we are willing to stop they're not sending rockets, they're sending balloons with bombs. We're willing to stop it if Qatar doubles the money they give us through Israel. Okay? So
right, that I heard. This
Qatar
shameless
like,
extortion.
How do you say sir lachatz?
A pressure cooker.
So you have a pressure cooker and you have the shastom.
Valve.
The valve, right? Qatar is the valve. Okay, Qatar is the valve of the whole thing. It can either go with Saudi, it can go with Iran, or it can remain somewhat independent, trying, to not have it go all the way. Now, again, we need to look at Libya, We need to look at what happens with Gaza. Um, and these are the areas where the proxy war is not hot yet, but we see some kind of consolidation. So these are, I'll summarize it just in a second, that after really 70 years of, of, of war, okay, we now see an Arab world that is willing to make peace with Israel. But unlike the peace of the 90s that was based on the Palestinians, this peace is because of fear of the Iranians more than because of love of Israel. And Israel is considered, again, part of the Middle East geopolitics. Now, again, Turkey and Iran are not good friends, and they're not going to be good friends. The ideology is very different. The religion, Turkey is Sunni, Iran is Shiite. Turkey has a minority of Shiites that are not treated very well in Turkey. So, but they do now align in the same interest in front of Saudi Arabia and Israel and Trump's America. And I think that we will see more countries like Sudan, like Bahrain, like Oman, like Morocco, the Sunni, I wouldn't call them moderates because calling Saudi Arabia moderate sounds weird. They're very harsh in their religion.
Even with MBS and his reforms?
Even with MBS and his reforms.
Women can finally drive.
I'm sorry, I lost you.
I said women can finally drive in Saudi Arabia.
You know, we're happy with women driving in Saudi Arabia, but we forget that women still need, for example, also in the United Arab Emirates, women need their permission from their guardian in order to get married, in order to open a bank account, in order to do a lot of things that in Saudi Arabia sometimes they're not even allowed to do. Saudi Arabia is still a kingdom where if you say something wrong about the royalty, about the royal family, you will get executed. If you blink the wrong way, you might get executed. If you steal, your hand would still be cut. So I wouldn't call them moderates.
No, I wouldn't either. Don't worry.
I think that would be a mistake. But I think we are talking about a Sunni Western affiliation or alliance, and Turkey and Iran trying to get, you know, their allies in the region and outside the region. So again, it's very interesting. I would like again to note that I being a left wing, it's not Netanyahu's fault or Netanyahu's it's not to his right that we have a peace agreement with the United Arab Emirates. It's more to the fact that we have a geopolitical situation right now where...
Right, but the fact that Netanyahu aligned himself very strongly against Iran, even during the very lenient period led by the former American president, might have gained points with the Sunni countries that feel immediate threat from Iran. So they know that they have Netanyahu, even if, let's say tomorrow you have President Harris. Okay, who knows? Like Vice President Harris becoming President Harris. Which
I'm not. We don't know what the future is.
Nobody knows.
And I think coronavirus is also, people are feeling it more with COVID-19, that the future is unknown. But I will say this. There is another way, okay? The Saudis, for example, in 2002, the Saudis made their first move. The first move was by suggesting peace, okay? A full peace, a full normalization.
Right, this event is really retracting the perimeters. As you said, that deal, the Saudi initiative or the Arab initiative or whatnot, it was based upon, was stipulated upon the Palestinian issue. When now this United Arab Emirates normalization is retracting that, the first time someone in the Arab world is retracting from that offer. And obviously, if the United Arab Emirates are doing it, it is not without Saudi consent, okay?
It is not without Saudi consent, but again, I'm not for attributing leaders. There's the big question in history whether it's history that makes the leaders or leaders that makes the history. I'm more for history makes the leaders in general, but also on that point, I would say that I think that the Saudis are still playing a double game, and we have to be sure around it, because although the Saudis made noises that they're very happy with the agreement, it's not an agreement with them, and they can still play the double game with Iran. Sometimes they bring them closer, sometimes they bring them farther away, and breaking from the Palestinian issue for the Saudis, not for the United Arab Emirates, who again are smaller and can play a more freer game. But breaking with the Palestinian issue for the Saudis would be very hard. Again, MBS is playing his own game. And Russia, of course, I didn't mention. What we also need to look at is not only Libya and Gaza, it's not only the local, but we also need to go global. And we need to look at not only Russia and the United States, but we also need to look at China. And Russia is right now backing the government in Libya and not Haftar. And Turkey is very hesitant in going against Russia head to head.
Right, they had a bit of a
to do it 4
kerfuffle.
years ago.
Right,
Didn't
5 years
well,
ago with the plane,
well.
it didn't end well for them. Right.
Yeah, it didn't end well for them, and so Russia is also in the game, and Russia is playing a containment game in the Middle East. Okay, they're trying to contain to have like a containment of the Middle East, and as long as we're not interfering with that, they'll go with us, with Israel, but they won't any new consolidation or any let's say disorder that will harm Russia in any way. They see the Middle East as their backyard. They need to keep it as quiet as possible, or fighting in itself, inside itself, inside the Middle East. And China is a whole different ballgame, because China is coming from two ways. China is first of all working with Iran with the agreement they have now, but they're also coming from Africa.
Right,
the
the Road
Chinese
and Belt
investments in
Initiative.
Africa are very big, and they're looking not
Right,
only
what's known as the Road and Belt Initiative.
the Road and Belt Initiative is more towards Russia, but yes, and also in the if you go to areas of Somalia, Djibouti, and a bit to the south, they're very interested in the
Djibouti
eastern.
is a fascinating case. By the way, I have a friend who is a doctor in the American military, and he spent like 8 months in Djibouti. Djibouti is this tiny country, guys. You wouldn't believe, but they have like 5 different powers having military bases there: China, America, Italy, France, and I'm probably forgetting someone. And
Probably
it's
Britain.
come again?
Probably Britain.
Britain, probably. And it's interesting, this small country, because it is on the straits here of Bab el Mandab, right?
And the whole road from China to the west and from China to Europe. So China and China also has this new policy of influence, which President Xi is leading. So the Middle East right now is it's consolidating around the Saudi line and the Iranian line and Turkey in itself, but again, it will never be played alone. There are the Russians, the Americans, although I have to say President Trump has not been very invested in the Middle East. Although, again, his peace initiative, he did put a peace initiative on the table, but it was never, President Clinton put almost all the credibility he had on the Middle East. President Obama was also not very invested. President Bush was definitely more invested in it. And I think what we also need to see is that the Americans, the Russians are inside the Middle East and are very involved because the Americans are no longer very involved in the Middle East. So again, it's going to be very interesting. I do think we are seeing a meaningful change in the Middle East. It did not start on Thursday. It will not end next Thursday, but it did not start a few days ago. It started with the Iranians awakening and the Sunnis trying to find their allies.
Right, we didn't get so much to see the PC though, but I'll ask you this. Let's take a crazy gambling number. Let's say a month from now, maybe a year from now, whichever one you want to take. How many countries do we have this normalizations with in a year from now? I know it could change according, but let's take a kind of an
I'll
educated
answer
guess.
that, but then you let me know. You let me say why I think it's not a good question.
Okay.
So I'll take your gamble. It's United Arab Emirates, it's Oman, it's Bahrain, who's next, it's Sudan, and it's Morocco. You have 5 countries that will have, if not embassies, then meaningful representations in Tel Aviv, not in
Interest
Jerusalem.
office, what's known as.
Yeah, well, it's embassies, consulates. It doesn't matter, but you have
Yeah,
them in
office
Tel
of
Aviv.
interest is like the lowest.
You
I
have
think.
5. You have 5, at least 5. You won't have the Saudis there. Okay, not in a month, maybe not in a year. But I will tell you why it's a problematic question, because I'm not worried about a year from now. I'm worried what's going to happen 20 years from now, 30 years from now. Because, and this is going back maybe to Seeds of Peace. No one is going anywhere. Okay, you and I are staying here. The Palestinians are not leaving. And eventually you have here 2 people, the Israelis, the Jewish Israelis, and the Palestinians, maybe 3. Palestinians living in Israel who define themselves, some of them at least, as Arab Israelis. And where is it all going? Okay, let's say we forget the Palestinian issue. Let's say we have peace with everyone, with Saudi Arabia. But if we do not solve the issue of the West Bank, and this is, I think, Netanyahu in this sense, and I'm going to say something surprising, is not right wing. He's center.
Oh,
Okay,
sure.
right?
You're not surprising me.
Right wing in Israel will say you can win this conflict. Okay, there's a way out. There's a winning in this conflict. If you will be persistent enough, the Palestinians will give up. Left wing are saying you can solve this conflict. Okay, the Palestinians will not give up, but we can solve it. Netanyahu is part of a big group in Israel, and I think this is a big part of it, of why people are voting for him. And we're missing that in general, that he's saying, listen, this isn't solvable. We cannot win this, and we cannot solve this. We have to manage it.
Oh,
Now,
sure. I'm
my
with
big
you on
problem
that.
with managing,
Netanyahu is definitely not trying to solve it. I think that this is something that he understood in his second term, not the first time he came to power, but a little bit later on. And sure, he is not implementing right-wing policies, not just in that, also in the economy, in my opinion, also in regards to the justice system, the judiciary. We had both Gil Bringer and Simcha Rotman speaking here, and Netanyahu. With the utmost appreciation, but as a right-wing voter, I am well aware that he is not implementing right-wing policies.
And I think this is dangerous, okay? From my point of view, and I think also from the right-wing point of view, because in 20, 30 years, if you only manage this conflict, what you'll get is a much harsher reality.
I'm not sure of that, because I'm not sure the reality today is harsher than the reality was in comparison 20 years ago. Okay, but yes, he is. I'm with you on on Netanyahu not trying to solve it. Okay, he had to pull this rabbit out of. People asked me about the annexation. I said, listen, exactly in regards to people asked me about Israeli politics. So I said to them about Benny Gantz. They asked me, are they really going to have like a split term? I said to them, listen, I don't know how Netanyahu is gonna what he's gonna do and how it's gonna happen, but he's gonna pull a rabbit out of his hat, and Benny Gantz would not sit on the prime minister throne, not even for one day. The same goes for the annexation. It was clear to any real right-wing voter that Netanyahu is not going to do an annex. I thought that he might have done like something small, just a gesture, but he kind of circumvented the different way to get rid of the annexation and not to implement right-wing policy with this. I'm sure he called the United Arab Emirates and he said to them, listen, but you have to demand that I don't do the annexation. It's so clear that this is how it works.
Listen, we don't know the future, but we do know one thing: Benny Gantz is not going to be prime minister.
Right,
Right?
right.
Everybody knows it. I think even he knows it. But again,
we don't know how yet. We don't know
yeah,
how
we
yet.
don't know. Do you wanna take bets on that? Because I have my bet.
Yeah.
It's gonna be the judicial system. It's gonna
Okay,
try
the
to fire
judiciary. Yeah.
fire Mandelblit.
Okay, to find the the attorney general.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's my bet. So I have two bets.
I don't have yet
Five countries and Mandelblit. You have
5
to invite
countries
me
in
again to
Mendelberg.
see if
5
I'm right.
countries I can I would have gone something like that. And as far as what's the listen, I was surprised as far as this card. I thought he would do, I don't know, something small, maybe. Listen, I would even further say that if it were to be up to Netanyahu, he wouldn't have moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. It wasn't up to him. It was up to Trump. So Trump
Yeah.
delivered on what he said, but Netanyahu would not have done it. He would have made a way to kind of call some part of Tel Aviv an embassy of Jerusalem, and then part of Jerusalem, and then make that or some other hat trick.
So
So
it's around the idea whether you manage the conflict, you solve it, or you try to win it in a way, or to. But Netanyahu is definitely managing the conflict, and again, we see the Arab world, or some of the Arab world, working with that again because of their own reasons. It's not that they hate the Palestinians or they forget about them. They didn't care in the first place. It's about the Iranians. It's about the fear from the Iranians.
okay, I think that we didn't get to all we wanted, and definitely we didn't get to talk about seeds of peace. And this very interesting program, which is involved not just in the Israeli-Arab conflict, but also with other conflicts worldwide.
Yeah.
So we'll definitely have to meet again for that. But it
I'm
was
always happy to
fascinating.
come.
Right, it was fascinating nonetheless. I have another guest which might be interesting for you. On the 31st of August, I'm going to have Dr. Moti Keidar coming on and speaking about his take from the Emirate, what Israel can learn from the Emirates, his famous Emirate suggestion. Obviously, it's going to be interesting, I'm sure. Yeah, and I know that you have different takes on this issue, I'm sure. And Betsy just watched him on TV last night. Yeah, he is, I would say, the best known Orientalist in Israel, if an Orientalist is a word
He's
today.
one of the very, very famous Orientalists.
I'm not saying that he's the best, but he's the
He's
very
very
well
famous.
known. Very
Netanel, can you hear me?
Yes, Betsy.
He was fascinating and talked about things I had never even thought of before, and how much your past 2 days of classes and what he is talking about and everything that's happening, a very great honor and pleasure to sit at y'all's feet and hear you talk about these things and think about these things. And Netanel, how much it all ties back to our beautiful Bible.
Yeah,
Isn't it beautiful?
Much. We didn't get to ask Iddo, but we'll have to ask Iddo about what he thinks the role of religion should be, is in the conflict and should be in the peace process. But we'll keep it for next time, Iddo. Betsy,
Okay.
so I'm so happy that you saw Professor Dr. Mordechai Kedar, for me, Moti Kedar, last night. Think of the question you want to ask him on the 31st of August when he comes on. Okay, I'll give you a chance to ask him a question.
It's too scary to think about talking to these people. I just sit at your feet and listen because so much more wisdom than I have. I don't know the answers to these things.
No, you just know, you have to know the questions. The answers, nobody knows. That everybody's got their opinion, and it's better to have an educated guess than a guess. But
I just tell you, I never thought of what he said last night, and I don't want to say too much, but it was brilliant, and I agree. And I think his ideas are so smart, and it has everything to do with the United Arab Emirates.
right. So
Very
we'll definitely,
similar
right,
concepts.
right,
Yes,
we'll talk about that with him, definitely.
Okay, it's good to be back with you some too. Thank you very much.
Sure, my pleasure, our pleasure. Iddo, it is always a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.
We will
Thank
have
you.
to have you. We always enjoy having you here. And again, we want to give you a hand here, a clap. Thank you very much for coming. We will have to talk about the role of religion in the conflict and Seeds of Peace, more about that fascinating program. Tomorrow, we have Yossi Klein Halevi. I don't know if you know him. Do you know Yossi Klein Halevi? He's from the Jerusalem Post. You might know, first of all, he wrote a book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. It wasn't published in Hebrew yet, but it will be published in Hebrew. So people, but you might know his book, his former book, Hayinu Kecholmim, like Dreamers, about 7 different paratroopers who participated in freeing. Oh, so you know the book. Very good. So he's going to talk with us about his Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. Very interesting fellow as well. And it's always, we only get the best, Iddo. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, guys. It's always a pleasure.
Rava, thank you very much. Very, very interesting.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.